Iowa continues to have one of the highest cancer rates in the country. State-funded cancer researchers are trying to learn if Iowa's water, or perhaps soil, or another external factor is to blame.
Some scientists say one challenge is the lack of environmental data, especially when it comes to pesticide exposure. Iowa Capitol Bureau reporter Isabella Warren explains why some experts say Iowa could look to another state for a possible model.
The question isn't just how many Iowans are getting cancer, it's why. And researchers say a key part of that puzzle is missing. Experts at the University of Iowa say the state doesn't have detailed monitoring that shows how much pesticide exposure people may actually experience over time. Dr. Mary Charlton with the state-funded research team says the state simply doesn't know how much pesticide exposure Iowans are experiencing.
What we don't know in Iowa is what is the exposure to non-farmers or non-occupational people in terms of agricultural exposures. We don't even know if and how they are exposed to pesticides.
Now that's especially important in Iowa, where pesticides are commonly used on corn and soybeans. Dr. Charlton says California could be a possible model. In California, regulators monitor pesticides much more closely. The California Department of Pesticide Regulation checks where and when pesticides are used and collects air samples around farming communities.
We talk a lot about water quality, and we should, but we don't talk a lot about air quality and what's in the air relative to people who may live near farms.
Charlton says systems like that can give her team a clearer picture of long-term exposure. Right now, Iowa doesn't have that level of statewide monitoring. But Governor Kim Reynolds says right now the focus should be on ensuring the data researchers already have is accurate.
You know, there's other reports out there that'll, I'm sure, factor into everything, but right now we'll probably continue down the path that we're on right now, see where they're at, and then we'll reassess.
Phase 2 of the state-funded research will continue focusing on those environmental impacts. Things like radon and nitrate levels could be included in that report that comes out June of this year. In Des Moines, I'm Isabella Warren.